So our first story is about a boy named Darren in the late 1980s who found a doorway to somewhere that should have remained closed. Now I found this in a ledger that was hidden at the back of the archives, and when I opened it, it had been scribbled out and scrawled by a previous librarian, almost in a way to cover up what she had recorded from maybe the person directly. I decided to send the ledger upstairs to be x-rayed so we could try and decipher some of the crossed out words that the previous librarian had destroyed. We believe here that they probably were crossed out to not cause alarm or panic to the general public if these had to go on public records. Luckily enough, they never did, and so we have them here. Anyway, I do digress. Darren and his friend, let's call him Thomas, were the kind of boys who would find adventure in abandoned places. They played where others would fear to tread, climbing down into the overgrown railway cutting on the south side of Sydenham Hill. The branch line to Crystal Palace had been closed for decades, the iron gates of the tunnel long sealed, but Darren, ever the stubborn one, found a way in. It wasn't easy. They squeezed through, scraping elbows on the rusty iron, but after brushing themselves down, they found themselves in the mouth of the tunnel, its darkness swallowing their small forms. The air was different there, heavy with damp and something else, a silence too thick, too intentional, like the tunnel itself was holding its breath. Even as I sit here writing this, I swear I can almost feel it, that unnatural stillness, the kind that makes your heart beat just a bit louder, your skin prickle just a bit more. It's not a memory I lived, but it's one that echoes through the pages. They had a torch, a flickering beam barely cutting through the blackness, and they walked deeper into the void. The further they went, the more it felt like they were moving away from the world above, from the roads, the woodlands, their homes, leaving behind everything they knew. Halfway in, Darren found it, a small opening in a brick wall, barely larger than the fireplace. Someone had scratched words above it, faint but unmistakable. To hell. But the warning didn't deter Darren. He was the kind that saw a locked door and needed to know what lay behind it. He threw a stone into the hole, and they listened. But there was just an echo, just emptiness. So, of course, he knelt and crawled inside, torch clenched between his teeth, and Thomas followed. It was tight at first, bricks pressing close, but then the space opened up and they found themselves in what felt like another world, a chamber of blackened brick, arched and empty, with passages leading off into more darkness. It does often make me wonder what I would have done if I was one of them boys, on my hands and knees crawling in the darkness, finding these strange rooms with blackened bricks. I honestly think I would have turned around and ran straight away, but luckily they carried on. Darren spotted another hole in the far wall. Crouched, he went forward without a word. Thomas followed, his knees trembling. Chamber after chamber they passed through, each one like the last, dead silent, unmoving, and each time they followed and reached a new room there was another opening, smaller than the one before, drawing them further into the dark maze. In the third chamber, Darren turned off the torch, and Thomas felt darkness pour over him. A darkness so complete it was like being swallowed by something ancient. Oh, that's quite scary, really, isn't it, thinking about it? Sorry. He thought of reaching out, of touching Darren's shoulder, but his hands wouldn't move. The torch flickered back on, and they both breathed a sigh of relief. Then Darren noticed the next passage, the last one. It led to a room smaller than the rest, barely large enough for both boys to crouch inside. In one corner was a mattress. It was filthy and decaying and covered in a sort of a waxy coating that had been left to melt over a very long time, and the air in that space was different, heavier. Thomas felt it, like the eyes in the back of his neck. He knew they had gone too far. Darren dropped the torch and the light went out. Thomas waited for Darren to curse, to fumble for it, but only silence. The darkness around him seemed to grow thicker, more present, and then came a soft scrambling. But not from where Darren was, but from the far corner of the chamber. It moved up the wall, across the ceiling, and then nothing. Thomas whispered Darren's name, his voice swallowed by the dark. He waved his hand in front of him, where Darren should have been, but nothing. The fear was paralyzing, the cold, weightless terror that numbed his limbs. He felt his way backwards, into the opening, not daring to turn back on that chamber, that mattress. He crawled painfully slow, the walls scraping his shoulders, the ceiling pressing down on his back. Thomas made it to the second chamber, and then the first, and only there did he turn back, scrambling towards the main tunnel. He didn't look back until he was through, until he was standing in the cold railway tunnel, the air around him almost comforting in his stillness. Something moved behind him, a kick of the stones, a touch of his arm. Thomas spun, ready to scream, but it was Darren. Darren, pale and silent, his eyes wide in the torchlight. "Come on," Darren said, his voice hollow. "Let's go." Thomas didn't question it. Didn't ask how Darren gotten past him, how he'd found his way out. They stumbled through the tunnel, out into the cutting, into the pale light of day. Only then, in the cold, thin air, did Thomas dare to look in Darren's face. But there was something missing in his eyes, something hollow. He looked haunted. Gosh, it's rather scary, isn't it? I have to take a pause every now and again to remind myself that these things can't hurt me when I'm here, reading here in the library. Anyway, reading on, it looked like Thomas, who was the one the librarian was interviewing, had suggested that they grew apart. Darren kept going back to the tunnel, always alone. Thomas never did. But the dreams followed him. Dreams of darkness, of narrow passages and blackened chambers, of hands reaching out from the walls, of Darren's face with empty holes where his eyes should be, dreams of something falling across the ceiling, of something whispering his name. And sometimes in those dreams, Thomas sees the chamber again in the last one, and the one with the mattress. He sees it as it was that day, and he knows. He knows that when he looks back, when he turns to face the darkness, there will be the face staring back at him. Not Darren's, not his own. A face with no features, no eyes, no mouth, just darkness, endless and empty. This is how Thomas remembers that day, and this is how I remember the story, logged here in the hidden archives of Bethnal Green, filed under unresolved. The kind of story that doesn't end, not really. The kind that waits, patient and cold, in the corners of the city until someone else comes along. Someone curious enough to open a door that should have stayed shut. Now, I thought this story was resolved at that point, but a year later, while cleaning out some of the archives, I actually found another log that reminded me of the story that I'd read a few years before, of Thomas and Darren. It was dated just a few years later, after Darren and Thomas's ill-fated adventure, and it wasn't just notes. This time there was VHS footage. Unfortunately, well, hopefully at some point the intern will be able to help us digitize these VHSs, but currently I'm not quite sure how to do that, so you'll have to bear with me. It was a little grainy, shaky tape that felt heavier than it should have done when I held it in my hands, like the weight was captured inside and settled into the plastic. Bizarre, I know, but have you felt a Betamax? You probably haven't, but if you had like a Betamax tape, they were much heavier. This was a VHS, but it was denser. There was like substance in it. Anyway, the point is, the footage was shot by someone who knew what they were doing, in a sense. You could see a team of two men dressed like contractors standing at the tunnel entrance. The date stamped at the bottom corner read 1994. The men had a portable light with them, the kind that casts harsh, almost surgical shadows. They don't look happy to be there, but there was a grim determination in their expressions, the kind you see in people who know they have a job to do, no matter the risk. The footage cut to them making their way out the tunnel. The light bounced off the walls, illuminating the same familiar bricks, the same gaping darkness. I recognised it immediately, the tunnel that Darren and Thomas had entered years before. They kept moving deeper, until the camera caught something strange in the periphery of the beam. It was subtle at first, almost like the darkness was a little thicker in one spot, clinging to the bricks in the way shadows shouldn't. And then it moved, just slightly, just enough to make the viewer question if they'd seen anything at all. The camera focusing on that very patched darkness, the longer the light stayed in it, the more the shape seemed to shift. And slowly, something began to seep from the wall. It was like a liquid shadow, viscous, creeping down the bricks and pooling at the base. The camera zooms in, capturing the glossy, almost oil-like texture of it. One of the men approached cautiously. He had a metal rod in his hand, the kind he used to probe at something dangerous without getting too close. So he reaches out to touch in this black ooze, and as soon as he did, it reacted, pulling back, like it was alive, like that Spider-Man film with the guy, his friend that goes bad. Anyway, first it spilled out from the crack, pooling and growing, twisting from the ground. The blackness coalesced and thickened until it began to take the shape of a something that was, I don't know, like wrong almost. It looked like a human, but stretched, elongated. The arms were too long, spindly legs. The torso was hunched. Had an ape-like quality, but there was nothing natural about it. The darkness that formed its body seemed to shift and ripple, like it wasn't fully solid, like it could dissolve back into the shadow at any moment. Then the contractors stumbled back and the camera started shaking wildly, and I could hear the panicked breaths and scrape of their bodies on the tunnel floor. The creature started to move slowly at first, almost uncertain, then with a fluidity seemed to deliberate. It turned its head, or what should have been its head, towards the camera, and even though the grainy footage, I could feel the malice radiating from it. There were no eyes, no face, just a void of darkness, and yet I watched. The thing almost knew I was watching it through the tape. It just stared at me and got closer and closer, and then it just cut out. And nothing, static. I mean, whoever logged this footage back then must have been just as unnerved as I was, because the note stopped there, incomplete, as if they couldn't bear to write down what they'd just seen, or maybe they simply didn't know how to describe it. I kept coming back to that footage in my mind, the way the darkness moved, the way it seemed to grow out of the very place Darren and Thomas had described years before. It made me wonder if there was a classification for something like this in the old system we use here. I ended up categorizing it as a Class 5 entity, an amorphous manifestation capable of altering its form, something between shadow and substance. It was unlike anything else I had logged before, but it fit the parameters of the phenomenon that could both affect and inhabit physical space in unsettling ways, so it makes sense. Makes me wonder what else is down there, waiting in the dark, hidden behind those walls. And how many times has it seeped out, only to slink back into the shadows, leaving behind nothing but fear and unanswered questions? It's things like this that I share cautiously on my channel. My intern says it's the kind of content people crave, but I don't know. I feel like they want to hear the stuff that is a little bit creepy, but won't keep them up at night. But stuff like this is different. My grandkids think it's cool, I suppose. In a way it is, but if they knew the real weight of the stories and the way they cling to you, haunt you, maybe they'd think twice before asking for more. With the intern's help, these recordings are finally seeing the light of day, or at least the glow of a computer screen. Maybe that's what these stories need, to be heard. Or maybe that's what they've been waiting for all along. Well, anyway, that's me signing off for today. Felix here at the Bethnal Green's Forgotten Library as the archivist. Apparently, if you enjoyed the content, ring a bell and follow me, or follow the channel. I'm not really sure. You probably know best. Over and out. Hello, today is October 15th, 2024. Felix here. I'll be honest, I'm not in the best of moods. Seems I've come down with the flu, and I know exactly why. Well, I've spent all week down on floor -5, updating the categories of content pre-2000. It's one of those jobs that should have been rotated, but between you and me, everyone's decided to take annual leave at the same time. And our interim director is, as usual, never around. That's the problem with these government-funded organisations. Instead of promoting from within, they bring in someone from the outside, probably ex-police or army, someone with level 5 clearance just to save the paperwork. Anyway, floor -5. The place has its own sort of atmosphere, if you ask me. I mean, we have protocols and the items down there are all categorized as safe, but that doesn't mean they leave some kind of residual aura, if you get me. You can feel it. It's a sort of bad lingering in the air. It's harmless, really, but it does make you wonder about the kind of things we're keeping there. And that's why we're supposed to rotate. No more than 2 days a week down there. Of course, rules go out the window when everyone else is on holiday. God, I can't even think when I had a holiday last. Still, it did get me thinking about a good tale to tell you. A story that might make you question what exactly we mean by safe. So, grab a blanket, settle in, get yourself some cocoa, and let me tell you about the object we call the laminate prism. It's an innocuous thing to look at, just a small glassy structure, roughly the size of a paperweight. You'd walk past it without a second glance, except it's always a little out of place. No matter where it's stored, there's an odd quality about it. You see, it doesn't reflect light the way it should. No matter the angle, it looks wrong, as though the light bends in directions your eyes can't quite follow. Like one of them paintings with the eyes, you know? Anyway, the prism first turned up in the archives in the mid-80s, dropped off by a man who refused to give his name. He left it in a box marked anomalous, non-life-threatening, and walked away without another word. No records of where it came from, no documentation at all. The only note left with it was a scribble on yellowed paper. Do not let it hear you. Now, that's not exactly standard protocol, but back then things were a bit more, let's say, relaxed. They tested it, found no immediate danger, and filed it under Class 1 residual phenomena. Class 1 residual phenomena. It stayed there for years, mostly forgotten, until one day someone decided to move it to floor -5. And that's where the stories began. Staff reported strange dreams, visions of places they'd never been, people you'd never met. They said the dreams weren't particularly frightening, but they left a kind of sadness, a lingering melancholy that hung around long after they woke. One intern claimed that in his dream he saw a prism sitting in the middle of a room, and it spoke to him. Not in words, what did he say? Feelings. A deep gut-wrenching regret that felt like it didn't belong to him. He said he woke up crying and he couldn't remember why. We started to take the report seriously, of course. They reviewed the protocols and even had the prism reclassified to Class 3, sentient spirits. But no matter what they did, the object itself never did anything. No moving, no ominous glow, nothing you'd expect from something meant to be haunted. Just this vague, residual sense of sadness. So it's still there on floor -5, sitting in a glass case, perfectly still, and yet every time I'm down there, I can't help feel like it's watching, like it knows. I know it sounds ridiculous, but there's a part of me that wonders if the old note was right. Maybe it does hear us. Maybe it knows all the stories we tell about it, or the theories we whisper when no one else is listening. So, that's one of the stories for today. A harmless little object that does nothing but leave you feeling like you've lost something precious, even if you don't know what it is. But maybe that's the scariest part. Not the things that leap out at you, not the things that scream or attack, but the ones that sit silently, filling the air with sadness that isn't quite your own. Maybe that's why I got the flu. Or maybe I'm just tired of being down on floor -5. Either way, I think it's time to get a hot cup of tea. But there was another one, actually, that I wanted to tell you. I remember the intern saying, tell them some of the juicy stuff. And I was thinking, well, I can't tell them the actual juicy stuff, of course, because I would probably get arrested. I used to tell my grandkids, I would say there once was a toy maker who made his little girl a mechanical doll, and as was tragically common in the olden days, the little girl succumbed to an illness, and after she passed, the toy maker would wind up the doll to dance and sing and remind him of his beloved daughter. But the truth is, this particular item was handed in to us just 7 years ago by a collector who said he couldn't take care of it anymore. It's a copper mechanical clockwork doll from the Victorian era. There was a toy maker shop that we were able to actually link back, but I won't give you the address to stop people harassing the location now, as I believe it is a pawnbroker's. Anyway, the toy maker's shop caught fire in a terrible accident. His daughter, not wanting her dolls to burn, ran back into the flames to save them. Days later, they found her charred remains clinging to the very doll lying on the shop floor. Awful. And now, every year, in the anniversary of her death, the doll does something peculiar. It spins just like a ballet dancer and hums a lullaby. Of course, there's no mechanisms within it that should allow this to do it either. Not after all those years, and certainly not without anyone winding it up. It's as if her essence is still in there, clinging to the doll as tightly as she did in her final moments. It's things like this that does make you wonder about the boundaries between life and death, and whether some emotions are simply too strong to fade away. On the anniversary, when I'm down on floor -5, I sometimes hear that faint humming. It's soft, almost gentle, but it sends a chill down my spine every time. It's not aggressive, not malevolent, but there is a sadness to it, a longing that never quite leaves. Maybe that's what happens to some of us. We hold on so tightly to the things that we love. Even when we're gone, a piece of us still lingers, perhaps in the echoes of once was. It's not always frightening, but it's certainly haunting. Anyway, I've spoken too long today. Until next time, and hopefully by then I've shaken off this flu. Good night, and I'll see you next time. Felix here today. Oh yes, Wednesday, October 16th, 2024. I'm finally back up on the ground floor of the archive, and my cold is starting to get better. It's been a long stretch in the archive working with the older, more esoteric collections, but now I'm finally back on the ground floor. I spent the day reclassifying some pre-1900 material, and let me tell you, it's not just dusty old books. Some of them items have an energy, a lingering weight that makes you feel like you're never quite alone. I can't help but wonder if being around them for so long has left a mark on me. Well, I guess we'll find out one way or another. But today, I am feeling better, and I want to thank you for joining me once again as we dive into the strange and the mysterious. These stories have a way of pulling you in like a shadow you can't shake. They remind us of a history that refuses to fade, the echoes that still linger. Today I want to share a story from my archive that I was reclassifying this week. It's one of those tales that sends a chill down your spine even after all these years, and it has a link to the great Christopher Wren and his beautiful churches. I'm going to call this one the Wren Churches. The medieval churches of London have a long reach. Though they were destroyed in the Great Fire of 1666, their after images still linger. Some exist as small City of London gardens, others live on the walls of churches that Christopher Wren built after the fire, his elegant designs forced to fit the odd, ancient foundations of their predecessors. This combination gives Wren churches their distinctive character. These churches faced destruction once again during the Blitz, and while some were rebuilt, others became gardens. Still, their stone-carved grandeur remains, even amid the modern bustle of the city. There's something comforting about stepping into the calm of a centuries-old church from the wind-blown streets of Moorgate or Bishopsgate. But you need to be careful before you step inside. The church I want to tell you about isn't easy to find. It's not on any map, and there's no plaque to mark its name. Some call it the Church of All Corners, within the wall. Those who have entered describe it as something unanchored, shifting, as though it exists outside of our time. The best account we have of this mysterious church comes from a 19th century document. It was an addendum to a survey of city churches conducted after the Union of Benefices Act 1860, which led to the demolition of several churches due to declining congregations. This document, written by a London corporation clerk, describes the plaque that shouldn't exist. The clerk wrote that one evening he came across a church that seemed unfamiliar. He was tired and initially thought his fatigue was playing tricks on him. The church's walls were solemn and solid, like something Wren might have built. But they felt wrong, bleak and unsettling. Inside, the darkness felt almost alive, untouched by the light from the high windows or a tear in the roof. The pews were scattered and broken, and the pulpit was gone. The clerk described feeling panicked and disorientated. The more he tried to leave, the more the building seemed to change around him, twisting and turning until it felt like the church itself was trying to throw him out. When he finally did stumble out, he found himself far from where he had entered, at the very edge of the city. The clerk, of course, reported it, and the corporation, of course, ignored it, and it remained forgotten for another 150 years until a city tour guide named Graham Herod found it. Herod, who called himself London's first portologist, had collected several accounts of the lost church. His research revealed a series of strange sightings: church bells heard at odd times, glimpses of towers down long-forgotten alleyways, and shifts in the landscape of the city. Herod described this as temporary untethered. Of course, here we describe these as just another temporal anomaly, maybe something that's trapped within two different pocket dimensions, or some sort of interdimensional portal where an element of a location isn't quite in the same time and space as the rest of the present time. Anyway, a building lost in time, drifting through history. It's as though it's constantly trying to reassert itself into the fabric of the city, struggling to remain relevant as the world changes around it. Perhaps it was the Great Fire, the Blitz, or a constant demolition and repurposing of sacred places that caused this dislocation. Wren's churches were rebuilt, bombed and scattered. Pulpits moved, spires relocated, entire churches shipped overseas. All corners within the wall may have been a casualty of this turmoil, something that couldn't handle being torn apart and forgotten. Imagine centuries of shifting landscapes, fires, bombings, demolitions, and even redevelopment projects that tore the very foundations of these sacred places. It's easy to picture the turmoil left behind. Perhaps all corners within the wall was torn from its place, its essence fractured, leaving behind a shell that refused to disappear entirely. Some believe that each piece of a dismantled church, each stone and beam carries a fragment of its original purpose, and when scattered, they yearn to reunite, to become whole again. Maybe that's what makes all corners so unstable, like a phantom structure pieced together from forgotten fragments, drifting through time, trying to belong somewhere. And maybe that's why it makes it so dangerous. Its desperation, its relentless attempts to claim those who enter, as if seeking to complete itself. Its dislocation and instability could explain why many reports hear the echoes of long-lost bells tolling at impossible hours, or seeing towers where none should exist. Where does it say this? Oh yes, here we go. Disappearing the moment you look away. It's as if the church is trying to remind the city it once stood proudly within its bounds to make itself seen, even if only for a fleeting, unsettling moment. There are even more unsettling accounts, and some are truly chilling. I've got one here from the late 1990s. It was at an anti-global capitalism protest. Interesting. A group of activists claimed they had stumbled into all corners while following the route of the buried river Walbrook. They discovered their experience in detail, and their testimony is deeply unnerving.
Afternoon, Felix. Just letting you know we've got code amber, level -2.
Right, okay.
It's been dealt with, so nothing to worry about.
Lovely, Jeff. Thank you very much. Okay. They said the air changed as soon as they entered, becoming unnaturally cold, and the space inside seemed to breathe a slow, almost rhythmic Sorry about this. Can somebody turn... Can somebody turn it down? The walls seemed to pulse, expanding and contracting, and their footsteps echoed strangely, as if swallowed by the darkness before bouncing back at them in different directions. Sarah, one of the archivists, had heard faint whispers, twisted murmurs that seemed to echo in a language he couldn't understand. He described the whispers as prayers that had been corrupted, the words backwards and malformed. The deeper they went, the louder the whispers became, until they drowned out everything else, a deafening roar that made it impossible to think. He said it felt like the church was shifting, the walls changing, leading them in circles, trapping them inside. I guess it kind of reminds me of them Harry Potter staircases. When they finally burst through the door and escaped, Sarah was silent, her face drained of colour, her eyes wide with terror. She refused to speak about what she saw in the darkness. The others described catching glimpses of something moving in the shadows, a figure impossibly tall with limbs so long they could scrape the ceiling. Though they couldn't make out its face, they felt its gaze, cold and malevolent, filled with hatred that seemed to seep into their very bones. It was as if the church had conjured something to expel them, something ancient and angry, determined to keep its secrets hidden. In the weeks after, though, strange things began to happen. Alex woke in the middle of the night to the sound of the church bells, though no churches were nearby. Another archivist found strange symbols etched into the walls of his flat, symbols like they'd seen inside all corners. And Sarah began sleepwalking, always waking up at the front door, her hand on the latch, as if something was calling her. Wonder if it was a siren or something. I should do some more research into this. And there's more. In January 2024... January 2024... Yes. I remember Michael working on this case. He had mentioned something had been found recently. A homeless man named Peter was found wandering near the edge of the city, disorientated and terrified. He had taken shelter in an old church. He hadn't been there before. It was late and he needed a place to sleep to escape the cold. He saw the faint silhouette in the church with the doors slightly open and decided to enter. Inside it was dark and oppressive. The silence felt heavy, almost alive. Strange carvings covered the walls, symbols that seemed to shift when he looked directly at them. Ah, yes, here we go. He heard a soft crying. Ah, this is new. But whenever he tried to find the source, the sound moved, echoing from different corners. He tried to leave, but every door led him deeper into the darkness. This is interesting. Peter saw a figure, so Peter must be the homeless man. A tall, shadowy shape that moved just out of sight, always at the edge of his vision. He felt it watching, a cold gaze piercing through him. He collapsed, his vision blurred as the shadow loomed closer, whispering the words he couldn't understand. He woke, and he was lying miles away from where he'd entered. His clothes were damp and covered in frost. His hands were covered in soot. Etched in the grime were faint symbols, the same ones from the church. Well, so he said. Obviously, we haven't got any actual evidence of what these symbols were, but... Okay, yeah, so Peter's stories matches the others. The disorientation, the strange symbols, the overwhelming dread. The church, it's as if the church doesn't just trap those who enter, but leaves a mark, a reminder that it exists, always waiting. Well, the Church of All Corners within the wall is classified as a Class 6 full-form manifestation. So what that means is it's a structure that appears physically, with a constant yet shifting form, aware of those who enter, capable of subtle, unsettling interactions. It's not just a place. We believe this would be an entity, a haunting of stone and mortar. And if you find yourself before the church that isn't marked and doesn't quite feel right, perhaps simply walk away. Yeah, well, the archive is full of stories like this, places, objects from moments in time that refuse to fade away quietly. They linger for someone to stumble upon them, someone curious enough to lift the veil. As much as I try to categorize and document them, there's always something that slips through, something that refuses to be pinned down. Anyway, I leave you with this thought. Sometimes the past reaches out, not with nostalgia, but with claws that seek to hold us. The next time you pass an old forgotten corner of London, remember, all corners within the wall. It might just be waiting for someone who isn't careful enough, someone who lingers in a moment too long. So tread lightly and keep your wits about you. The city has secrets it prefers to keep. Well, this is me, Felix, logging off for today. Thank you so much for joining us, and sorry about that little interruption. I think whatever's been going on down there is now being hopefully fixed and sorted, and I'll see you again tomorrow. Hello, Felix here. Today is October 20th, 2024. I'm going to start by saying that this video is more of a warning. Today we're dealing with a Class 7 manifestation, one that is currently active and potentially dangerous. This isn't just another ghost story, this is about something deeply rooted in history and tied to an ancient order that perhaps disturbs forces they never should have. If you're a new listener, welcome in, and if you're familiar with our work, then you know that these classifications are not taken lightly. So today it's a little bit different. We have a field report that currently landed on my desk from the requirement team. It's about a sighting at St Botolph's Priory in Colchester, Essex. Now, most of you probably aren't too familiar with this particular priory. It's tucked away in Essex, far from the well-known landmarks of London. But this report caught my attention not just because of what happened there, but because of what followed, right back here in the heart of London. Before we go into details, I just want to say it's a bit of a whirlwind here in the archive. Between the never-ending paperwork, the budget disputes, and the new interim director who's convinced she knows how things should be run, it's been difficult to focus on what truly matters. But when the report came in, I knew this needed my attention. There's something about St Botolph's that demands a closer look. Right, have a bit stretch. The requirement team's report, dated just last week, details a sighting of a hooded figure moving silently among the ruined arches of the priory. Now, the priory was once home to the Canons Regular of St Augustine, also known as the Augustine Canons. It was a site steeped in ritual and secrecy. The canons, unlike friars, did not commit themselves to corporate poverty, and their abbeys were bastions of spiritual authority. Yet, in the pursuit of understanding, it seems they may have delved into forces beyond their control. Unfortunately, the person who reported the sighting has suffered from several psychological distresses, ongoing nightmares, paranoia, and a sense of dread that lingers. They've had to take leave of absence, and it's unclear when or if they'll fully recover. A witness, a security guard on duty after dark, had described the figure as a monk, tall with a heavy robe that seemed to shimmer in the moonlight. But unlike some of the other accounts of shadowy figures, the monk was physical, real, almost tangible. The guard described its face as old and tired, like a mummified visage, as though it were desperate to help or be helped, yet it seemed to bring only harm. The figure appeared, disappeared, then reappeared again, always just on the edge of his vision. And the air turned freezing cold when he stepped into the ruins, and soon began hearing whispers, faint, almost like prayers but twisted, spoken in an unrecognizable language. And then he felt an immense pressure on his chest, and the sensation that something was forcing the darkness in the ruins to close in, making it hard to breathe. Then finally he saw the hooded figure standing near what used to be an altar, head bowed, as if praying or lamenting, before vanishing into thin air. Naturally, I decided to dig into older records to see if there was any history of this kind of activity at St. Botolph's, and it turns out that the Augustinian canons who lived there were known for their strict adherence of spiritual rituals, often involving praying, that were said to protect not only the inhabitants but also the land itself. Now the thing is, looking further on, it's very interesting because the priory is more than just a religious centre. It was a focal point for spiritual energies, both light and dark, and it turns out that this is far from the first report of ghostly figures in the priory. Even in the 1960s, there was multiple accounts of hooded figures, sometimes called a monk, wandering in the dusk. There's a chilling detail that those who see the figure often feel that it follows them home afterwards. They leave the priory, but something comes back with them. Now right here I have a particularly unnerving account from 1986, a man here called Richard Black. It dates July 23rd, and he'd been visiting his family in Colchester. On his way back to London, obviously he had been to the priory as part of his day trip, he started to notice strange things happening. Subtle things like doors ajar that shouldn't been, cold spots in his hallway, whispers just at the edge of his hearing. But it escalated. One night he found the same hooded figure standing at the foot of his bed, face obscured but feeling he'd been watched. He even said it felt as if the figure was waiting for something. In the end, he moved out of his flat, but even then he claimed to catch glimpses of the monk in reflections, in mirrors, in windows, even in puddles on the street. There's some more recent reports that follow a similar pattern. People visit St. Botolph's and feel an inexplicable chill, a sense of dread that stays with them long after they leave. Some see the monk again, not at the priory but elsewhere, at a bus stop, at a train window, reflecting in shop front glass, always just on the edge of their vision, never fully visible but undeniably there. One woman said she felt an intense pressure on her chest every night for weeks, as though the monk was standing over her as she slept, refusing to let go. There's something about St. Botolph's Priory that refuses to be left behind. The priory was built on a site with centuries of history, and the destruction it faced during the English Civil War left deep scars. Royalist troops had taken refuge there, using the ruins as a defensive position, but when the parliamentary forces finally assaulted the priory, they found all the royalist men already dead. It wasn't the battle that had taken their lives. Something far more sinister had intervened. The canons regular of St. Augustine had once occupied the grounds, and their practices, though rooted in faith, may well have stirred forces beyond their control, for the site itself had originally been a Saxon church, and was considered by the Anglo-Saxons, who were pagan, as a site of spiritual significance. Now, they revered in the land Vettir, spirits of the land that were believed to protect sacred places. Now, these spirits were bound to the land, and they were respected and feared, and were given offerings to keep them appeased. The soldiers' bodies were found with crosses charred to their foreheads, their faces twisted in expressions of unspeakable terror. It was as if they'd been caught between two worlds, perhaps victims of a spirit that had once been a guardian, now twisted by centuries of conflicting energies. Some accounts whispered among the parliamentary troops claimed they saw strange symbols etched into the walls, symbols that would glow faintly even in the daylight. And for years afterwards, those who had witnessed the scene kept it closely guarded, fearing that something far darker than war had taken place in them ancient stones. It was only a few years ago when the MOD released the papers about this, deeming now it's almost insignificant. And even me myself, I didn't log it with the other accounts that were to do with St. Botolph's, just considering it an old folktale. This entire situation reminds me of another case from a few weeks back, one involving an old chapel in Southwark that had a similar entity. Witnesses there reported seeing a hooded figure, and in that instance several people found strange burns on their skin in the shape of a cross. The entity was hostile, and multiple intervention steps were made to quell the disturbances, though the results were mixed, to put it lightly. Given the similarities in the ongoing reports of this hooded figure from St. Botolph's, my assessment is that we could be dealing with a Class 7 malevolent manifestation, an entity capable of psychological and physical harm, this being maybe the result of a spirit that was possessed when it died, forming a chimera of unholy energy. The Augustinian canons, in their attempt to protect the priory, may have inadvertently drawn upon the power of Lan Vettir, binding something ancient to their rituals. Once a monk, now a twisted presence torn between its original purpose and the dark forces that overtook it. This entity seems desperate for release but brings only harm. It has the potential to follow and torment those who encounter it, a lingering presence that does not easily let go. The requirement team may be sending their exorcism branch down to Colchester soon. This kind of entity is beyond the usual containment efforts, and if it's still causing harm after all these years, it's clear that strong measures need to be taken. Now, when I say sending the exorcism branch, it's not as simple as giving them a call. It's not exactly Ghostbusters. There's an incredible tedious and bureaucratic process that makes you wonder if the real challenge isn't dealing with the entity, but rather the paperwork approved in time. First, of course, there's the Form E39, which officially requests the intervention of the exorcism team. It has to be filled out in triplicate, detailing the exact nature of the entity, the classification, all prior recorded incidents, any psychological or physical harm caused. Then there's Form H12, which requires a hazard assessment signed off by the two senior archivists, stating that the entity poses a level 4 or higher threat. Doesn't end there, of course. There's also the mandatory risk mitigation report that needs to be submitted alongside, explaining why the containment measures failed, blah, 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 blah. Anyway, once the initial paperwork is complete, the exorcism branch must convene a review panel, which can take anywhere from a few weeks to a few months, depending on how many other cases are waiting for review. During this time, they assess whether the risk justifies the resources required, considering everything from specialized equipment to potential personnel losses. After all that, there is a liability waivers that need to be signed by every member of the team, acknowledging the dangers involved and absolving the archive of responsibility in case of, well, anything. And with good reason. The last time the exorcism branch was deployed without adequate preparation, it ended in disaster. It was a case involved in an abandoned manor up north, a Class 7 entity that had been manifesting for decades, haunting the place with increasing aggression. The review panel rushed it, and the team was sent in without all the necessary precautions. The paperwork wasn't fully vetted, and the risk mitigation plan had gaps. 2 members of the exorcism branch, both experienced operatives, lost their lives that day. One was caught in a sudden structural collapse triggered by the entity's presence, while the other succumbed to a violent psychic attack that left them incapable before they could be evacuated. The fallout was enormous. Investigations, inquiries, more forms, and a heavy weight that the rest of us still feel to this day. The truth is, dealing with entities like the one at St. Botolph's is very dangerous, and despite the bureaucratic red tape, it does exist for a reason. It's there to make sure every precaution is taken, every dot is ticked, and every risk is mitigated. If the exorcism branch are going to culture, let's hope they have as much help as possible, maybe even help from the good canon spirits that are still there, because whatever is in that ritual site, it certainly doesn't seem to want to go. Anyway, until next time, please stay safe, and remember, sometimes the past isn't just a memory. Sometimes it reaches out, and when it does, you'd best be ready. I also want to thank the new listeners who joined us here on YouTube. Your support means a lot, and if there's anything specific you think I should look into, please let me know in the comments. Remember to like and subscribe. Take care. The night was silent, unnaturally still, as if the entire world held its breath. A perfect setting for a crime yet to be solved. Shadows danced across the grand halls of the Alexandra Palace, a light flickering, casting strange shapes on the walls. Mary Shafton stood in the centre of the great hall, her eyes fixed on the rose window above, her face pale, with a mixture of determination and fear. The air was charged with an energy that felt almost alive, humming and crackling around her. She knew she was close, too close perhaps, to uncovering something that no one was meant to see. The sudden, echoing crash from one of the far corners of the hall sent a chill through her, but she stood her ground. The bomb had hit, and they were running out of time. Felix back again with another story that's kept me awake a far few nights, I can tell you that. It's the 21st of October, and I've got a fantastic one from the archives. I do believe this may be still an ongoing issue, but I haven't had any recent reports, so maybe we're in the clear. Even so, it's a fantastic one I really wanted to share with you. I really love this one. It's really fun. This one is like a mix of science and the occult, and almost like a detective novel. Okay, so you have to imagine, here's the scene. The war is raging across Europe, and in the hidden halls of the great Alexandra Palace, something truly dangerous was brewing. So let me take you back to 1945, where the lines between science and something much darker began to blur. A group of scientists, led by the enigmatic Mary Shafton, are attempting to harness an unknown form of energy, a force derived from ancient Egyptian relics stolen by the Nazis during the height of the war. Mary had turned double agent, defecting to work for the British, offering her knowledge of these ancient artifacts in exchange for protection. She was brilliant, but relentless, her cold demeanour leaving many of her staff fearful. But fear or not, the scientists and technicians worked tirelessly under her direction, driven by the promise of discovering an energy that could change the course of the war forever. Mary's research centered around extracting what she called ethereal resonance, natural energies that she believed were embedded inside occult relics, such as the items the British Empire had found in ancient Egypt. These artifacts, including the Staff of Set and the Amulet of Anubis, were inscribed with symbols and runes that suggested a connection to some forgotten force, a power that could be invoked and harnessed. Her aim was to channel this energy into a usable form, something that could potentially turn the tide of war. The experiments were fraught with danger, the lines between science and the occult blurring more with every attempt. To the British government, desperate to gain an upper hand, it was worth the risk, and they decided to turn a blind eye to Mary's methods, even when she resorted to experimenting on animals and eventually prisoners of war. The great hall of the Alexandra Palace had been transformed into a laboratory filled with arrays of equipment, resonance chambers, amplifiers, and symbols drawn in chalk on the floor. The researchers worked day and night, their faces pale from lack of sleep, and the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to grow heavier with every passing day. Some of the scientists began to whisper about the strange occurrences that seemed to follow their work. Objects moved on their own, shadows shifted when no one was near, and the temperature in the room would suddenly plummet. The air was thick with tension. There was a palpable sense that they were pushing it too far, and something was pushing back. The starter set was used to amplify the resonance within the hall, and the amulet of Anubis was placed in the center of the array, believed to act as a conduit between realms. Books would slide across tables, chairs would scrape across the floor in the dead of the night, and instruments would topple with no visible cause. To me, this kind of intrigue is what makes it worth to work here, those unexplainable moments that make you question what lies beneath the surface of history. One incident stood out among the rest. In here on page 14, it says about a glass beaker. A scientist had wrote it was filled with a strange liquid and it shattered spontaneously, shedding shards flying across the room. The researcher who'd been holding it claimed he had felt a force, a pulse of energy that emanated from the beaker itself. Of course, this could have been a reaction of different chemicals, but he also mentioned that when he picked up the shards of glass, there were almost charred fingerprints on the glass, as if something from somewhere else had touched it or squeezed it to break. Mary Shafton's theories were not just about energy. She believed that these artifacts could channel a sentient force, something ancient, something with a will of its own, and she also believed that they could control it, that they could harness the power beyond anything conventional science could offer. But the deeper they went, the more erratic the phenomena became. Researchers reported seeing lights, small floating orbs, moving erratically across the room, almost as if they were alive. A technician claimed he heard whispers emanating from the resonance chamber, voices speaking in a language that sounded ancient, neither German nor English, but something altogether different, possibly Egyptian. The use of the amulet of Anubis was particularly concerning. It was said to hold the essence of the ancient Egyptian priest, bound within it to guard the secrets of the underworld. During a particularly intense experiment, the energy reading spiked. The equipment began to malfunction and the strange hum filled the great hall. The sound seemed to vibrate through the bones of everyone present. The ceiling lights started to flicker, and suddenly the scientists, one by one, dropped to the floor, eyes wide in terror, skin a pale green, claiming they had seen figures and hands reaching out from the light, trying to grasp at them, as if dead on cue to try to cull the creatures crossing over into this dimension. The bombs fell onto the building, causing shockwaves of broken glass and debris to flutter room to room until the entire building was engulfed in a thick smog. When the smoke had settled, it became clear that most of the equipment had survived, and at least 3/4 of the personnel were uninjured. Despite this, it had become clear to Mary's military handlers that this was too dangerous, and quite likely there was a German mole somewhere in the building, tipping off the locations and the research that they were uncovering. They promptly made the decision to close everything down, to pack away the research, to bury everything they had uncovered, but of course, it was already too late. Something had already been unleashed inside the building. Mary herself wrote in the final notes that she feared she'd opened a door that could not be closed. Her notes, and some of the other notes from the scientists at the time, described shadows that followed her, growing darker and more solid with each passing day. She also wrote the presence that seemed to settle in the room at night, a chill that gripped her soul, and whispered voices that filled the silence. Her last entry was chillingly abrupt. "We've gone too far. I fear it's too late to stop it." It wasn't just the immediate danger that haunted Alexandra Palace. It was what happened on the locked-off floor below that really made a difference going forward. This was the basement where many of the experiments took place that involved the prisoners of war. Even decades later, we find report after report of people claiming the same thing. Pockets of time that seemed to shift. People would enter the floor only to find themselves trapped in what appeared to be the 1940s, but inhabiting the bodies of the prisoners of war using Mary's experiments. They described hearing the hum of the resonance chambers, feeling the cold, damp air, and experiencing the horror of being experimented on, only to suddenly wake up traumatized but back in the present day. For them, what felt like weeks had only been hours in reality. But the trauma was real, and they carried with them the memories of fear and pain that were not their own. Complex descriptions of experiments that no one could have known except for Mary herself. And we had the ability to cross-reference these with Mary's own recordings of her experiments. And it was only till recently when the Ministry of Defense had released this information, meaning that over the last 30 years, no ordinary citizen who had ventured down there and experienced this would have had access to her writings. Decades later, the echoes of Mary's work still linger. Today, Alexandra Palace stands as a monument to history, but beneath its grandeur lies a dark past. Those who work there now report strange occurrences. The security guards speak of fleeting glimpses of robed figures standing by the rose window, a figure that vanishes when approached. Technicians have reported equipment failures, sudden power outages, and a cold that sweeps through suddenly out of nowhere. It's almost as if fragments of Mary's lab, lost in the chaotic experiments of the past, are slipping through time and reappearing in the present. Well, listeners, I do have an update though. That was going to be the end of the story, but just as I was piecing this all together and ready to send it off to the intern to post it on the YouTube, I received an email from a colleague with access to the old military archives. And I must say, this is an email I have been eagerly waiting for. It says, Alexandra Palace Project, new findings. Now, although I must admit, a lot of these stories are steeped in the blood of innocence, and it is awfully sad and terrible what happened, but as a archivist and historian and someone who wants to log these findings and ensure that nothing happens again so terribly, my heart did skip a beat when I opened it. We finally had an outline of some of the stuff that had really happened. We had direct information from a staff sergeant who was posted there to check up on Mary, and these are his personal notes of what he saw, things that were never officially put on the record. The first attempt was an experiment, and this was to harness what Mary called the ethereal resonance. There were diagrams, these were intricately hurried, showing an array that had been constructed in the Great Hall. There was also an attachment that contained a report after the sergeant had spoken to one of the technicians, and it was also a first-hand account of the final night. The staff sergeant described a strange hum, an almost mechanical resonance that seemed to grow louder the further the scientist pushed, until the vibration was going through their bones in a way that felt wrong and invasive. To me, this is the essence of these tales. The thrill of discovery tinged with danger, the feeling that you're brushing up against something far greater than yourself. Mary Stratton theorized that they had unleashed something ancient, something that thrived on the basest human emotions: fear, despair, anger, and it was drawn to them like a predator sensing weakness. Once it was free, it wouldn't stop. It would seek out fear, feed on it, and grow stronger. And that's when the realization hit me like a lead weight. They hadn't just opened a door, they had invited something through, something that had been waiting on the other side for centuries. But what if it wasn't what we thought? What if somehow the figure in the shadows wasn't an entity of malevolent force, but something trying to communicate a warning? One of Mary's assistants, Evelyn Clark, had tried to continue the work after the project was abandoned. Her notes suggested that she too had experienced visions, dreams that seemed more like memories. She saw herself as Mary, reliving moments from the experiments, but in a world that had been destroyed, a wasteland ravaged by atomic fire. What if the figure was Mary herself from another timeline, another version of reality where everything had gone wrong? What if she was trying to reach out, stop the experiments before it was too late, to stop them finding the ultimate source of power and engulfing the world in atomic flame? The idea was both terrifying and fascinating. A future Mary, twisted by her own desperate attempts to undo the damage, trying to warn herself or perhaps Evelyn before history repeats itself again. And now, decades later, the echoes of that dark presence are still out there, waiting. The people working in the Alexandra Palace today still report strange anomalies, the objects appearing from the 1940s, seemingly untouched by time, and rooms that appear and disappear as if fragments of the past are slipping into the present. Maybe it's not the malevolent force we assumed. Maybe it's Mary Strafton herself, fractured across the timelines, trying to warn us of an impending disaster. What if this robed figure is future Mary, trapped in a timeline where the experiments led to a dystopian Armageddon, trying desperately to reach back and change the outcome? It could be Mary trying to avert the dark future she foresaw, a desperate attempt to prevent her own research for an unleashing catastrophe. Perhaps in her desperation, she has become a twisted, fractured presence, struggling to help, yet inadvertently causing chaos in her attempts. Whatever it is, it leaves us questioning what boundaries we may have crossed and what the consequences will ultimately be if this dark future can be avoided or if it has already begun. Looking at the evidence, it seems to me that we're dealing with what I would classify as a Class 5 temporal rupture phenomenon, a kind of disturbance that creates micro interdimensional pockets capable of affecting the human soul. These pockets seem to pull individuals into them, and they force them to inhabit the first available vessel. Because we see that some have reported experiencing life through the bodies of the prisoners, while others through the animals used in the experiments and even the scientists themselves, each living as if they were merely passengers, watching history unfold. I'll be logging this in section Delta 5 of the archives, where we keep records of phenomena involving multi-dimensional and temporal disruptions. The real challenge isn't piecing together what happened, it's figuring out how to prevent these echoes from turning into future catastrophes. Anyway, and as always, the search for answers goes on. I'm going to enjoy a lovely cup of hot chocolate, and I've just picked up a sausage roll this morning from a cute little bakery. I'm going to enjoy that, and yes, and I think I'll have a lovely day. Sorry to waffle on. I hope you've had a lovely day too. Remember to like and subscribe, and to leave me some comments if you're enjoying the content, as that's super helpful. The internet mentioned that as the channel is so young, doing that will really help us. And all the best. Have a fantastic evening, and I'll see you again soon.